let's handle another aspect of the upcoming election. All of you have heard rumblings about the Electoral College and challenges and all that kind of stuff. Brad Smith is an expert on these kind of things. He used to be chairman of the Federal Election Commission. He's now a professor and heads up a free speech institute at Capital University and Capital Law School, I think. In any case, he also is winner, and Brad, I want you to explain this one when you come up. He's the winner of the Bradley Prize. Brad is the winner of the Bradley Prize. Maybe he can explain to us how that happened. So coming up to introduce his panel, Brad Smith.
Thank you, Tim. The Bradley Prize goes to the best Bradley in the country each year. In any case, we're here today. This panel is titled, Does the Electoral College Matter? You might as well ask, does the Constitution matter? Of course it matters. It's in the Constitution. And if it didn't matter, people wouldn't be trying to change it. So we're going to talk about how it matters and why it matters. And I'm joined by two old friends. It's weird because they're very young people, but I've known them now both for quite some time, in part through CNP. We'll be joined by Trent England, who is the Executive Vice President of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, and also the Director of Save Our States, which is a national effort to defend the Electoral College. And he hosts the Trent England Show podcast. Previously, he was Executive Vice President of the Washington State Freedom Foundation, and he served 2 terms on CNP's Executive Committee. Trent lives with his wife, Cheryl, and their children in Oklahoma City. And also with me is Tara Ross. Tara is a nationally recognized expert on the Electoral College, beginning with her first book about 15 years ago called Enlightened Democracy. She is the author of many other books, including Why We Need the Electoral College, and even one for children, a children's book on the Electoral College, We Elect Our President, the Story of the Electoral College. On PragerU Video, her PragerU video, which is called Do You Understand the Electoral College, is the most watched video ever under the Prager family, with more than 60 million views. She and her family live in Dallas, Texas. So I'm going to come over here and join them. We've ordered up some room service, but until that comes, we're going to have like a casual conversation on the Electoral College. So Tara, I'm going to start with you. Just tell us, first of all, as a quick review for everybody, what exactly is the Electoral College and how does it work?
Okay, thanks y'all for coming and listening to this important topic. When you go to the polls on election day, it looks like you're voting for the presidential candidate directly. You're not. You're voting for a slate of presidential electors in your state. We actually conduct a 2-part election in this country. The first phase is the purely democratic, one person, one vote election that you're used to on election day. Each state will decide how to allocate its electors. Most of them do this in a winner-take-all fashion. I'm from Texas. We got 38 electors. We give them all to the winner of the Texas vote. Then the second phase of the election occurs in December, and that's when these electors that we've elected go to their own polls, usually at the state capitol, and they cast their votes for the president of the United States. The actual presidential election is that second election among the presidential electors. If no one gets a majority of this, there's actually even the possibility of another phase of the election. This would be a backup election process in the House of Representatives, and in that process, each state would get 1 vote. We haven't used that process since 1824.
Okay, and so one thing about the Electoral College is each state gets 1 vote for each member of Congress and 1 vote for each senator, and as a result, Idaho would have 3 votes, and California, 50 some or whatever, but Idaho's getting 2 senators, California's getting 2 senators, and some people find this to be a very troubling possibility. So Trent, elaborate on this for me a bit more. Tell me what's going on with efforts to amend the Electoral College, why, and what the main effort is at this point.
Yeah, so I find that a lot of conservatives have seen that, AOC has tweeted about how she doesn't like the Electoral College. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, all these people have railed on the Electoral College, and people don't realize, there's a good constitutionalist reaction to that, right? Which is, well, fine, you go blow off steam, but you can't amend the Constitution. The problem is, there is this state-based campaign to hijack the Electoral College that would have all of the same effects of getting rid of the Electoral College outright. And it's called the National Popular Vote Campaign. It actually goes back to when Al Gore lost. after 2000, and a couple of liberal law professors cooked up this idea. Tara just explained how the process worked. Well, imagine if a state passed a law that said, we're going to ignore how the people in our own state vote. And instead, we are going to choose our presidential electors, effectively give away our electoral votes based on the nationwide vote, right? It would be as if you had a direct popular election for president, even though you still have this zombie electoral college, right? And even there, right, some people say, well, no state would ever do that. 15 states, plus the District of Columbia, have already done that. They have 73% of the electoral votes that they need to hijack the Electoral College through this national popular vote legislation. And it only takes effect if they get to 270 electoral votes. And so you can't, sometimes people say, well, surely we can sue, and maybe we can get a court to strike it down, maybe we can tie them up in court. The problem is you can't even sue and challenge it until you lose, right? Until they get to 270 electoral votes in this compact. And this is a real threat to the Electoral College, and I'm glad that we can talk about it.
Okay, so you need 270 votes to win the Electoral College. And this National Popular Vote Compact says it kicks into effect when states that control 270 electoral votes have all agreed that they're just going to give their electoral votes to whoever wins the nationwide sort of total votes if we add them together from all the states, right? That's the basic concept here. And they don't care how their own state voted. So if President Trump were to win the popular vote, California would give its electoral votes to President Trump, even though he's probably not going to carry California, right? Okay, so that's the scenario. I think it's probably fair to say that most of the people promoting this think the more likely scenario is the opposite, that a liberal candidate would win the popular vote. Is that fair?
That's pretty clear when you look at where the money comes from and who's running this campaign and who came up with the idea. When you look at all the things that really matter, you kind of pull back the curtain, that's true. But right now, on the other side of the country where I just was yesterday, there's a group called Conservatives for National Popular Vote passing out literature at CPAC. So it's true that this is a movement of the left. It's funded by the left. It's run by the left. In every state where they pass it, typically, almost all their support comes from the left, but they are very savvy to, they get all those votes by default. And so they focus almost all of their lobbying to try to win over or at least confuse people on the right.
Okay. Now let me ask you one more question, then I'm going to go back to Tara. But so we've had 4 elections in the United States where the winner of the Electoral College has not won the nationwide aggregated popular vote, at least 4 since we started having some kind of nationwide count in 1820. And those are the elections of 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016. But let me ask you this. Okay, so Tara said we vote by states, right? I mean, what is the national popular vote? Is there a national popular vote?
Well, that's thank you for that very hard question. Very great.
That's my job.
This is actually one of the things that I remind state legislatures. Right. One thing that this national popular vote campaign cannot actually do is create a national popular vote. There is no national popular vote. Every one of the states that passed this legislation to join this compact would, for itself, certify what it believes is the national popular vote total. Right, so you would have, if they get enough states, if they get up to 20 or 22 states to put this compact into effect, you would have those 20 or 22 states actually each one of them claiming to have figured out what the national popular vote total is. And to do that, they would have to trust, with no power to verify, the election results in every other state. Which, if you think that through, obviously would be a disaster. And it's why one of the law professors who came up with this idea has been very honest and said, look, it's more of a tactic than a policy. It's a tactic to destroy the Electoral College outright, to create a scenario where the only way out from the national popular vote disaster would be to amend the Constitution. And even conservatives who care about defending ourselves from vote fraud and things like that might at that point throw our hands up in the air and say, well fine, we will accept wholesale change as a way to prevent Chicago and LA from stealing elections. I'm probably getting ahead of ourselves.
No, so one other thing that about this idea of a national popular vote is, of course, all these states vote under different rules. Some states have no early voting, some states have long early voting, some states allow ballot harvesting, some states do not. Some states allow convicted felons to vote, some do not. Some allow them to vote once they're out of prison, even though they still have probationary periods. So there's all kinds of different rules, different polling hours, and so on that would make a difference in how states are tallying their totals. So, but let me ask you then, Tara, let's go over to you. So what's wrong with having a national popular vote? Even if we have to amend the Constitution, it's democracy. Let's have the people vote and get rid of this electoral college that occasionally, it looks like 4 times in 48 elections, has led a person to win the electoral college without winning the popular vote. Why don't we just go to national popular vote?
So there's 2 reasons. One is, of course, you just want to keep the Electoral College, and anything that would get rid of the Electoral College is bad in my view, and I'll expound on that. The second reason is because if we are going to get rid of the Electoral College, a constitutional amendment is a much more sane process to go through. So I'll start with why the Electoral College is good. The most basic thing that you need to know to understand our Electoral College or our Constitution is that the founders were not trying to create a pure, simple democracy. They knew their history. They knew the history of failed democracies. They knew that would not work. They knew it would implode. But they had just fought this revolution, right? They had put their lives on the line for the idea of self-governance. So clearly, they were not unconcerned with democracy and with being able to vote and do all the things that we want in our electoral college system. But they knew something that we have forgotten. Even if they had been given a seat at the table in Parliament, that seat that they were fighting for, they would have been outvoted time and time and time again by the majority of citizens at home in England. So they knew something. They knew we have to do better than just a simple up and down vote in our election systems. That won't work. And indeed, when they got to the Constitutional Convention, the small states would have none of it. They did not want a national popular vote. They knew they would be outvoted. They knew they would be tyrannized by the large states over and over again. So our Constitution works to put in many safeguards and checks and balances, and the Electoral College is just one of these. And in fact, as it has worked out in practice, historically, it encourages coalition building, it encourages working together, it encourages a lot of things that are really, really good in a country as diverse as our own.
How does it do that? How does it encourage coalition?
Well, it does it because, if you're a Democratic candidate today, and look at what you would do, or Republican, look at what you would do if you're with the Electoral College or without the Electoral College. Hillary Clinton, without intending to, demonstrated that you cannot focus too much on one part of the country. She did overly focus on New York and California and a handful of safe areas. She got 20% of her vote from only those 2 states. She got most of her vote in those states from the urban areas. That strategy does not work. Okay, with the national popular vote in place, she would have profited from that. She would have, and in fact, in the next election, Democrats would probably double down on it and work even harder to do that. It would leave vast portions of the country completely just, unheard. Republicans could do the same thing. They could run down to Houston and cater to the oil interest. There are lots of different ways in which this could hurt our country and ensure that only one region or one industry or subculture is being heard. So our system, by contrast, requires multiple victories simultaneously across state lines, across regions. You cannot win the election unless you do that. And so by its nature, it encourages you to learn about people that aren't like you and to try to understand them and to find similarities and common ground with them. Other things that are benefits of the Electoral College that people don't think about is it works to prevent fraud. Okay, now if you think about, again, contrast the 2 systems, put them side by side. With an Electoral College, you have to know where to steal your vote, when, what state. You need that state to be close at the right moment in time. At the same time, by the way, that the whole nation is close, so that swinging only 1 or 2 states will actually get this done for you. Those elections are rare. It was very unusual in 2000 that 1 state could flip it for Bush. And it's just not something, but even if it does happen, and you are able to predict which state, which part of the country to go to, probably everybody else has too. And it's really well defended, and we're none of us naive enough to say it's impossible, but it's as hard as you can possibly make it. In 2004, everybody thought Ohio would be that state. We all know people that went there and that watched the polls, that were ready for lawsuits or recounts or anything that needed to be handled. It was closely, closely watched. By contrast, if you're looking at a direct national system, then you have the opposite situation. Any vote stolen anywhere at all can make a difference. You can go to the bluest blue California precinct and rack up as many fake ballots as you want, or the reddest red Texas one, and do the same thing, and you have affected not just one state that was already safe, but you've affected the whole national total. So the Electoral College creates a lot of balance in our system. It balances different needs and interests and different size states, different rural versus urban. There's so many things that are so carefully balanced because of the way that our presidential election system is structured. And it's, we would all be really sorry if it were gone.
Okay, so you say, this is just going to be you have to form a national coalition, right? But do you really? I mean, let's face it, we've got a handful of swing states, and this is where all the attention's focused. And your vote doesn't even matter, says Pete Buttigieg, if you live in the South or in Indiana. He's concerned that citizens of Fort Wayne don't get to see, no, he's not from South Bend, a much smaller place. He's concerned that the citizens of South Bend don't get to see presidential commercials, which citizens of South Bend may actually like, but is this a problem, right? I mean, it's just a handful of swing states. Who wants to take this?
I can.
Sure.
Okay. I've got all of these examples in my head. Look, if you look at the full history of states voting, then what you see is there is no such thing as a permanently safe state or a permanently swing state. It changes all the time. You cannot ignore a state. You cannot forget about a part of the country. You can try, and then you'll regret it. Ask Hillary Clinton, again, from the blue wall states in 2016. She took Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania for granted, and she lost them. You can ask Al Gore from 2000. He took West Virginia for granted. It was then a very safe blue state, and he lost it. And because he lost West Virginia, he lost the whole election. Or you can ask the Trump and Pence campaign from 2016, why did you have to rush off to Utah in the closing days of the campaign? And the answer is they were afraid they were about to lose their safe red state, little red state, and because it was threatening to vote third party. If you look through history, you can see a bunch of southern states that voted for Bill Clinton that wouldn't be caught dead voting for Obama. California used to vote Republican, Texas used to vote Democrat. People are worried now that Texas is going to swing purple. And why worry about Texas swinging purple, by the way, if it's not important? Every single state matters all the time. Did you want to add on?
One thing that helps to explain, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And it's really, I think, Tara, I've heard you say this before, it's really a question of when states make up their mind, right? Every state matters. It's just that this quote-unquote safe states have already made up their mind earlier in the process versus swing states where they're so evenly balanced. We have to see the same thing in congressional races and Senate races and gubernatorial races, right? It's just a reality of electoral politics. But it does explain why the one group on the right that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes does actually support this are political consultants. Because if you're a political consultant in New York, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it doesn't matter. If you're in New York, if you're in California, somewhere like that, you just see dollar signs. And I had Republican legislators in California when this came up asking me, well, why does my consultant support this? And once I explained it to them, then they voted against it. But that is a constituency, a very small constituency, that thinks they would make a lot of money off of shuffling up the system.
And the swing states are pretty different in makeup. For example, I did some looking at this recently, and of the states that were decided by 10 or fewer points last election, and that sounds like a lot, 10, but remember that means you just have to swing 5% of the electorate to get a different result. They included 3 of the 8 states with the highest African American population. I think it was 4 of the 5 states with the highest Hispanic populations. And yet it also included 3 of the 5 states with the highest white population. It included manufacturing states like Ohio and Michigan. It included Farm Belt states like Iowa. It included New England states like Maine and New Hampshire, and Mid-Atlantic states like Pennsylvania, and southern states like Florida, and western states like Colorado and Nevada. So they're really a pretty diverse bunch that you've got to try to appeal to, and you can't, if you plug everything just toward, the manufacturing centers, you're going to alienate those farm states that are also swing states and so on.
No, that's right, and it changes all the time. I mean, it's, we're always fighting the last war, right? Everybody's always focused on what happened in the last election, and you see that from these national popular vote lobbyists. It's well, there were only rallies in these states, or or those states, or money was only spent here or there. And yeah, when you start looking back over time, and Vermont was one of the reddest states in the country, right? California was the big swing state for quite a while. My home state of Washington State, used to be a swing state. Now it's a pretty blue state. And I live in Oklahoma, where it's been a red state in presidential politics for a while, but it was a Democrat state up until just about a decade ago, in every other way.
Okay, now Trent, First, I want to take some questions from folks in a little bit, but I got a couple other questions here. I want to focus on this. So we have this national popular vote is adopted. It takes effect, probably not going to get done before 2020, but let's say it's adopted in 2024. You've got their momentum going forward, and the nation votes, and some state decides, say California, well, we didn't think we were going to have to cast our votes for some, Republican Trump successor, and they say that's not how we're going to do it. What happens?
Well, that's a huge question mark. And there's question marks all over this because, nobody's ever, before Al Gore lost, nobody ever thought you could do this, right? I mean, that's why people say, well, why didn't the founders protect us from this? I mean, this is an idea so dumb James Madison never worried about it, right? I mean, the idea that state politicians could get away with just giving away their citizens' voice in presidential elections, I mean, it's just preposterous, right? It takes a lot of progressive ideology to think that that's a good idea. And so the compact, to make it really saleable, is very short. So it doesn't address. It does say that, well, states can't drop out within 6 months of the election, but there's no enforcement mechanisms on any of this. And my biggest concern is, do we really think? Well, not one of my many concerns. Do we really think that if MSNBC, Rachel Maddow is reporting that the only reason why Nikki Haley is slightly ahead in this election in 2024 is because of vote suppression in Texas, right? Do we really think that the California Secretary of State is going to just say, well, I got Texas vote totals and I'm just going to put my seal of approval on that? I mean, it's preposterous, it flies in the face of human nature, but what that really means.
Then what happens?
Federal judges. I mean, that's all. Everything gets turned over to the federal courts, which are better now than they were, 4 years ago. But that, I mean, it is a disaster. And as I mentioned, that's why Vic Amar, one of the law professors who came up with this, has never actually joined the National Popular Vote campaign, even though this is his brainchild, because he is a patriotic American enough to worry about this.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, you can.
Actually, not only would it be difficult for those states, he mentioned Texas barely, or the country barely going for Nikki Haley and California refusing to accept Texas votes. Well, not only that, but Texas could on purpose inflate its vote and mess with NPV.
It's not that any Texans would be working with the legislature to do that.
I'm kind of stubborn Texan, but look, there is nothing in the compact that enables those states to force the non-participating states to act in any particular way. And if the non-participating states want to make life difficult for the national popular vote states, then they absolutely can. 2 states have already introduced legislation. It's not going to pass, but they did introduce legislation suggesting that they would withhold their popular vote totals in any year where the compact is in effect. I wrote an editorial a few weeks ago where I came up with as many fun ideas as I can. For instance, what if we said, Texas, now you get 3 votes? Every candidate, you can cast all for one, you can spread them around among candidates, do whatever you want, but the national popular vote people, what they get is an inflated vote total from Texas.
So California, if they wanted to gin up the votes in California, which they presume would go Democratic, they could, for example, lower the voting age to 14.
It's a race to the bottom.
Or 12.
Yeah.
It's a race to the bottom.
Right.
Well,
and it gets 12-year-olds voting, and the 12-year-olds vote pretty much like their parents who vote overwhelmingly Democratic, and they'd figure this would be ginning.
And that's part of the point, actually. I mean, you think about the left's larger election agenda, right? Which state, if you go to a national popular vote system, which state has more political power? Is it the state that has no voter ID checks, that looks the other way when non-citizens and even illegal aliens vote, or is it the state that takes voter integrity seriously, right? I mean, right now, elections are contained within state lines. So, California can basically do whatever it wants. However blue it gets, its electoral votes are what they are, right? They don't get multiplied because there's more illegal votes in California. Under a national popular vote system, every state would have an incentive to go that direction, right? This would reward the blue state agenda and the only self-defense mechanism that conservatives would have. And I think this is, working on this for the last 12 years has given me so much respect for the left, because they understand the kind of things that the American founders talked about, right? Incentives matter. Human nature matters. You change the underlying structure and you can force certain outcomes. If they get a national popular vote, conservatives will demand that the federal government take over our elections, because it will be our only defense at that point against vote fraud. There would be no other way for us to prevent blue states from stealing the election. And this is what the left wants, right? Elizabeth Warren actually last year openly said, we need national voting, and to do that, we have to get rid of the Electoral College, right? I mean, this is the linchpin. You pull this out, and you set the left's election agenda just sliding into place, and there's nothing we can do about it.
So I want to go back, though. I want to go back to first principle again. People say, it should be a popular vote, right? And let me ask this question. Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of the law school up at Cal Berkeley, has written, so this is an off-the-cuff comment, he says, we are the only country that allows the person who finishes second in the popular vote to become the chief executive officer of the government. Is that true?
Not by a long shot. I mean, this is one of the I won't call it a lie, because maybe Mr. Chemerinsky just doesn't know what goes on in the rest of the world. But I mean, this just happened last year in Canada. The reality is that most of the other major quote-unquote democracies around the world use a two-step system. Most of them are parliamentary. But some of them, like Germany and India, actually have a kind of quasi-electoral college. India, by the way, is far more complicated than ours is. And they actually call it an electoral college. The big direct popular election countries are, setting aside Russia and Iran. The Ayatollah, by the way, last week tweeted about how he doesn't like the Electoral College. Which, sometimes it's just great to have. You can't choose your enemies.
I mean, some of these countries they're cursed with proportional representation. So the voters go to the polls. You vote for somebody. You have no idea who's actually going to win, and then after the election, the politicians get together and figure out who's going to run the government, right? So that's where the voting truly doesn't matter. But even kind of leaving those nations aside, there's a lot of nations where the second place finisher has been able to form a majority government. Yeah. Right out of the box.
Happens all the time in Parliament.
Like you say, Canada last year, also Canada in 1979. Yeah. India, you mentioned. India, I know this happened in 1991 and in 1999, fairly recently. In Australia, it's happened 5 times since World War II. In England, it's happened twice since World War II. In Canada, it's happened, well, we mentioned Canada twice. And one thing that strikes me as interesting is if you think about the really large-scale democracies, geographically large, Canada, India, the United States, Australia are probably the 4 largest geographic democracies. And they're the ones where, in a way, it makes the most sense that you have a system that requires the candidate to try to pick up support in a large number of diverse geographic areas. And I just think that's worth pointing out, that people will tell you everybody votes, every country elects the winner. No, almost every democracy allows the second place finisher to win in certain relatively rare circumstances.
Well, and even with a direct vote, the same thing happens. I mean, this is the other side. I think some of them, it's not that they're lying, they just don't really think about how any of this works, right? This happens in direct vote countries. The big ones are Mexico and France, right? Mexico and France have direct election systems for their presidents, and you still get somebody like Emmanuel Macron, he got 23% in their first round election. And that was enough to make him the highest vote getter, and then he was he's sort of the default choice in the runoff. This happens in Mexico where they don't even have a runoff, and so you get all these small plurality winners who are second, third, fourth choice of people. So I mean, the reality is the direct election systems oftentimes produce less democratic results than our electoral college.
You know, ironically, it might happen in the Democratic primary. I saw a poll yesterday or the day before that they polled Democrats and said, if Bernie Sanders wins a plurality, so he doesn't cross majority, but he gets the most but not a majority, do you support some other form of election for the nomination at the convention? 50% of Democrats said they supported flexibility in that circumstance, which I thought was hilarious because, I mean, it's not the Electoral College, but it's kind of that idea of we're going to let the second place winner maybe move ahead.
Okay, now before we go to questions, we got to get down to serious brass tacks here. Let's be honest, because I've heard this from Elizabeth Warren and others, I think. Isn't this really all about slavery?
We're busted.
No, I mean, this is a serious argument. Tell me about this argument and what people say on this.
People have been saying this in the past year and a half or whatever. And look, if you can tarnish the Electoral College with that label and say it's only about slavery, it's so much easier to get rid of it, right? And so that's why they're saying it. But nothing could be further from the truth. So let's run down why they say it. They point to one statement made on one day of the convention by James Madison. That statement is taken out of context. I can't quote it directly for you right now, but it sounds horrible. It really does sound horrible. And then they say James Madison spoke about electors in practically the next sentence. And oh, you know, proof. And they point, well, a couple of things. One is, if it really was about slavery, wouldn't there be more than one statement on one day at the convention? I mean, wouldn't there be a whole bunch of things they could quote? You would think. But also, it was taken out of context. What they were really talking about that day was separation of powers, and should the president be re-electable, or, you know, if the legislature's selecting the president and we give him, he can have more than one term, then maybe that violates separation of powers. That was the discussion on the table, and this was an off-the-cuff remark made by James Madison that had nothing to do with anything. And also, other people that day also made statements in favor of electors, even before James Madison started in on it. And these were all individuals that had worked against slavery during their lifetime. If you look at the division in the convention, it was not a division between slave states versus not slave states, or lesser slave states, because I think all states still had some slaves at that point, but it was a division between big states and small states. Some of the big states had slaves, some didn't. You know, New York, Virginia. Or you look at the small states, like some of the smaller southern states, and then you got a state like, I don't know, Massachusetts or Delaware or something. Was Massachusetts a small
Rhode Island might be a good
Rhode Island is better, but Rhode Island wasn't at the convention. So, I mean, but the division was just, it was between small and large. That was everything, especially when it came to the presidential election system. That was the division, and that's how you see people falling along lines.
Trent, you don't remember Madison's quote, do you? I don't
terrible.
remember
It's
it. He was something about, basically he was just talking about, look, if we're going to form a national government, we got to get every state on board, and you're not going to do that because if they don't.
Well, and the irony, yeah, he talks about the Electoral College, he talks about presidential elections, and he talks about the problems for the South in the context of really, at that point, supporting a popular election. You know, Madison was one of the people at the convention who flirted, I mean, I think he was always half-hearted in this, but he was so against the original parliamentary model that was in the Virginia plan that the obvious, you know, the obvious other way to do it, right? You had the parliamentary model, you had a direct election. And so if you didn't like parliamentary, a lot of the delegates, like Madison, supported a popular election for a period of time. And so the irony is that these statements that people point to that, well, Madison was pushing for, you know, I mean, he was really pushing away from the parliamentary model towards what these people actually say they want, right, during this time. And then the flip side of all of this is that people talk about, well, you know, the slave states had these interests because they were small states. Virginia was the biggest state, whether you included slaves or not, at that time, right? I mean, it didn't make any difference for Virginia's relative position. They were number one.
Okay. Now I'm going to go back up to the podium just so I can see out the audience better, and let's see if there are a couple questions that anybody wants to raise. Yes, sir. No.
Great presentation. Great presentation. Thank you. So we have great stability in our country politically, I think, because of ballot access laws in all the different states. And so most states, you've got two main parties, and if some other party is going to get on, they need to collect a lot of signatures, or they need to show that in the last election, a certain percentage of the vote. And I think that leads to stability. We have two main parties, Republican and Democrat, and this system that these professors are talking about is chaos. Aside from these erudite discussions, how do you recommend we talk about this to people who haven't got a clue about this?
I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that I think that's a great point to make to people is, I mean, the burden of proof is always on the other side when you talk about constitutional change, right? We have a system that has provided the stability, and I think, sometimes, maybe I'm going to say something that's really politically incorrect at CNP, but, I think sometimes we talk maybe too much about liberty and not enough about stability. You only get liberty in the long run if you have stability, right? We have a system that's provided the stability that allows us to be free and prosperous. And yeah, I mean, changing the fundamental structure by which we elect the President of the United States, which governs the way that the coalitions are built that become our political parties, is a radical change to our system of government. And people, this sounds like a cheap shot, but it's not. People should look at Mexico. The kind of system that they're trying to create would have no runoffs, straight plurality, direct election system. I mean, people should look at the system in Mexico. That's what they're trying to create in our presidential elections, and it is no paragon of either integrity or stability.
See, we have time. Again, it's pretty hard to see here. We're going to go over here. Can we get a microphone over? We'll go over this side.
Brad, I got one.
Okay, you've got one here with a microphone. Okay, let's do that then. Just for time's sake. I'm sorry.
Something that should be pointed out, I think, is that we have a two-party system. We only have a two-party system because the Electoral College requires that anybody who becomes president must carry more than half of the nation. Now, the second you do away with the Electoral College and go to the most popular person, then every movie star, every billionaire, every basketball player, every governor, every senator is going to run. How do we know that? In California, when they removed the governor, and they had 48 hours in which to choose who wanted to run, 136 candidates ran. And who won? Arnold Schwarzenegger, the movie star. Now, if we do away with the Electoral College and go to whoever gets the most votes, everyone in the world the presidential ballot will look like the Manhattan phone book. There is no way to overemphasize the significance of the benefits of having a two and only a two-party system, which means that every time there's an election, somebody gets 51% of the vote. And that is preserved only because of one thing, what might have appeared to be a throwaway line, except that Benjamin Franklin said that this was divine intervention. And this Electoral College made it possible for us to survive the way that we have. Anything short of that will be a banana republic in which everybody's going to run.
Thank you, Bob. Do either of you care to comment?
I can pile on to that. That's a great point. And if you doubt that it could happen, all you have to do is look at France, where they routinely have 10, 12 candidates on the ballot. Two candidates earning less than 20% apiece land on a runoff. I mean, is that really a good system where then you have a runoff and you can choose between people that were rejected by 80% of the population? You can look at the Democratic primary right now and what's going and how the field is so fractured. That's what happens in multi-party systems. To be fair, the exact same thing happened in the Republican primary in 2016 with 17 candidates on the ballot. It fractures people. It's the opposite of coalition building. There's no reason to come together because the attitude becomes my 18% beat your 17%. Don't care about you. And that's bad for our country.
Okay, back here.
I'm from Tennessee, and I want to say that even I've had some Tennessee legislators be a part of this Conservatives for This movement that we've had to talk to. My question is, you say we're close. What are the states that you're concerned about right now that are considering this, and what do we need to do to help defeat that?
Yeah, I'll say something about that real quick, and I know we have an action session on this topic later, and then I'm hosting a reception at 5 o'clock in Pavilion 1. So, and we'll talk about that a lot more then. But we just managed to beat this for the year in Virginia on Tuesday. And, Virginia, Democrat trifecta state after last November, so that was a big win. But a provisional win. They voted to punt it to next year. The states of major concern on this are Nevada, where we got the governor to veto it last year. Maine, we got some Democrats to flip and beat it in Maine last year as well. Obviously, Virginia again next year, also Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Mexico passed it last year, but depending on what happens in the election, maybe a possibility to try to get it repealed there. The biggest fight going on right now, though, is in Colorado. You know, the Democrats took Colorado in 2018. They shoved this through last year, totally party line. The Republicans there did the Lord's work standing up and fighting against this and made a huge issue out of it. Once Governor Polis signed it, they got a record number of signatures to take this to a referendum, which means that the people will vote on it this November. And if we are going to stop national popular vote and save the Electoral College, we have to win in Colorado. That's what we're going to be talking about at 5 o'clock tonight. I mean, this conservative for national popular vote group really is just a couple of people. Saul Anuzis and Ray Haynes, if any of you know them, are kind of two of National Popular Vote's top lobbyists. Michael Steele is also on their payroll, but it's really almost nobody beyond that. But they take Republican legislators on these fancy junkets, and then I have to go in and deprogram them.
Okay, so we're going to cram in a lightning round question real quick over here.
Yeah, real quick. It seems to me like two really simple arguments that I seldom hear in favor of the Electoral College are, one, we're the United States of America, not the United People of America, which is what the Founding Fathers intended. And there's a lot of state pride around the country, so you'd essentially wipe out the states. But second to that is, if you're going to argue for doing away with the Electoral College, it seems to me like you can't do that without logically argue for doing away with the Senate, because literally every bill that is passed in this country passes the same essential process, because it has to get a majority of the representatives and a majority of the Senate, or it's never passed. So you've got Klobuchar, who's a senator, Biden, who's been a senator, Warren, who's been a senator, Sanders, who's been a senator, and in that sense, they were in favor of senators having this massive power, or states having this disproportionate power.
Okay.
Yet they forget that then. I'd like you to speak to that argument.
Okay, real quick. Anybody have any real quick comments?
I mean, I agree completely. And the Constitution, as I said earlier, is just a balance among states versus federal government, elected officials versus the people, judiciary versus legislature. There's all of these careful balances in our Constitution.
And then there's that whole pesky Bill of Rights that just takes some things off the table. So there's lots of things that check the majorities. Well, in any case, we are going to take this up again specifically for those interested in how to combat this at the afternoon workshop, How to Preserve the Electoral College and Maintain Voter Integrity. That'll be at 3:30 in Salons 1 and 2. And again, as the topic suggests, we'll be talking about a few issues beyond Electoral College as well. So please join me in thanking Trent and Tara for that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad, for that. I'm ready to fund a Trent Prize and a Tara Prize to go with your Bradley Prize. That was a discussion of how the overall electoral system might be manipulated. I'm excited about this next speaker because he's going to dig into another part of manipulation. What if, when you actually have your vote, you're being manipulated? The gentleman who's going to come and speak to us, Robert Epstein. Robert exists in a different world than most of us. He's kind of on the cutting edge of technology and science and how it overlaps with politics. And one of the things he's studied is this whole idea of manipulation by search engines. He's an author of 15 books, about 300 articles. He's actually going to be signing books at 3 o'clock. But I'm just excited to hear what he has to say about this. So Robert Epstein, please come in.
Oh my gosh, very bright lights. I know, I'm trying to see if there's anyone I know.